Hello friends, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekhachari Wagh, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. Today we are going to discuss the module on Telangana Movement. This module is part of the paper Agrarian Relations and Social Structure in India. This paper is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur of IIM Kolkata. What are the important issues that this module raises? It raises the nature of peasant mobilization in India. Further, it goes into a discussion of agrarian structure in the region, especially in the context of insurgency. Further, it also looks into the structural coordinate of feudal exploitation in Telangana. All these would bring up to an understanding about the various issues that Telangana movement raised with regard to agrarian structures in India. Telangana movement. Social movements have always been an inseparable part of social groups. Through collective action, organized protest and resisting the structures of domination, peasant movements have historically paved the way for a new thoughts and actions that revitalizes the process of social change. Telangana movement was one such movement in the 20th century India, which ended the feudalistic oppression of the landlords and the autocratic Nizam rule in the Telangana. The Telangana movement of the mid-1940s and the early 1950s was unparalleled in the 20th century history of India for its intensity, participants' militancy and the height of revolutions they ascended. This radical peasant resistance had put forward the question of agrarian revolution, by which Indian communists dreamed simultaneously of freeing agrarian society from the feudal strangehold and restoring and distributing land to the tenants and the tillers. It had compelled the unwilling Congress party leaders to embark upon various agrarian reforms, however hard-hearted and pitiful they were. It was during the course of this struggle that the Bhutan Utopia was conceived by Vinoba Bhave, the Sarvodaya leader. Another important contribution of this movement was bringing the idea of reorganizing the states on linguistic basis in the country. It was through this struggle that the states' reorganization on a linguistic basis had come up. It was one of the two post-war insurrectionary struggles of peasants in India. Launched by the Communist Party of India, the then undivided United CPI, after the shift from its early policy of corroboration, United Front, and with the Congress Party to a strategy of encouraging or initiating insurrectionary partisan struggles in India. It began in the middle of 1946 July and lasted for over 5 years till it was called off in October 1951. Historical setting. The Hyderabad state, which was formed by the Nizam after the death of the last Mughal emperor, was one of the largest princely states in the India after independence. The Nizam, who was the seventh in the line, was also one of the wealthiest rulers in the world. He ruled the state from 1912. The Hyderabad state consisted of 3 linguistic areas, the 8 Telugu-speaking districts within Hyderabad city, the capital of the state, constituting the Telangana area. The 5 Marathi-speaking districts in the northwest of the state, constituting the Marathwada region, and the 3 Kannada-speaking districts in the southwestern part. The Telangana region occupied 50% of the area as against 28% occupied by the Marathwada region and the remaining 22% by the Kannada region. The Telugu-speaking population in 1951 was almost 50%, the Marathi-speaking population almost 25%, and the Kannada-speaking population was 11%. And the Urdu-speaking population 12%. Since the Nizam was a Muslim, Urdu was made the language of the courts and the administration at all levels, and also the medium of instructions from the primary stage. The language and culture of the overwhelming majority of the people was suppressed by the rulers of the state. The fact that the Nizam of Hyderabad was a Muslim and the vast majority of the people of Hyderabad state belonged to this Hindu religion and its various texts was reflected in the administrative setup. Types of land tenure. The agrarian structure of the region was like a page from a medieval feudal history. The basic feature that dominated the socio-economic life of the people of Hyderabad and especially Telangana was the unbridled feudal exploitation that persisted till the beginning of the Telangana armed peasant struggle. There were 2 kinds of land tenure system prevalent in the state, the Khalsa or Diwani and the Jagirdari. The Diwani or the Khalsa government land revenue system. Out of the 53 million acres in the whole of Hyderabad state, about 30 million, that is about 60%, were under the governmental land revenue system in other parts of the country, that is the present proprietary system. The landholders were not called owners per se, but were treated as pattadas, that is registered occupants. The actual occupants within each patta were called shikmidars, who had full rights of occupancy but were not registered. As the pressure on land grew, the shikmidar, previously the cultivators of land, began to lease out the lands to subtenants, and these subtenants were also known as Assami shiknis. Assami shiknis were tenants at will, having neither legal rights in land nor any protection against eviction. On Khalsa lands, Deshmukhs and Deshpandes were the hereditary collectors of revenue for groups of villagers. These intermediaries, Deshmukhs and Deshpandes, were granted watans, that is annuities, the right to receive income based on the percentage of the past collection. Very often the Deshmukh landlord himself became the newly appointed village revenue official, or at least had access to land records. The influence of the village of the Deshmukh permitted him to grab lands by fraud, which in countless instances reduced the actual cultivator to the status of tenant at will or a landless laborer. The Deshmukhs and Deshpandes, who were earlier tax collectors for the government but who were after direct collection by the state apparatus was introduced, granted watans or mash annuities based on a percentage of past collection in perpetuity. These Deshmukhs and Deshpandes, as collectors of tax, grabbed thousands of acres of the most fertile cultivated land and made it their own property, reducing the peasants cultivating these lands to tenants at will. The scale of acquisition of the land can be judged from the fact that a Janara Reddy Pratap Reddy family had 1.5 lakh acres of land and had laid a mango grove on a plot of 750 acres. These landlords were not only Deshmukhs but were also village chiefs, Patel, Patwari, Mali Patel, with hereditary rights. Each one of them had about 5 to 10 villages under him as watan. These watan villages were controlled through clerks and agents Seridas appointed by the Deshmukh. These Seridas collected products from the peasants by force. They did various other jobs for the Deshmukh, including supplying information about the village. In Telangana, the Vetti system was all pervasive, affecting all classes of the people in varying degrees. There was a prevalence of keeping girls as slaves in the houses of the landlords. When the landlords gave their daughters in marriage, they presented slave girls and sent them along with the married daughters to serve them in their new homes. These slave girls were used by landlords as concubines. The Vetti system of life made Telangana people one of abject serfdom and utter degradation. It ruined a man's self-respect completely. The movement for its abolition became widespread. The administrative report of 1950-51 showed that in 3 districts of Nalgonda, Mehbubnagar and Warangal, the number of pattadas or landlords owning more than 500 acres each were about 550. They owned 60 to 70% of the total cultivable land. Jagir Tenures. Sarf-e-Khas Jagir, Nizam's personal estate. This was assigned to the Nizam himself as crown lands. This was scattered in several parts of the state and covered a total area of 8,109 square miles, that is 1,961 villages, and fetched revenues totaling about 20 million rupees, which met the Nizam's household, retinue and other expenses and partly met the cost of his army. 10% of the total constituted Nizam's direct estate, the Sarf-e-Khas system. Non-Sarf-e-Khas Jagirdari land given as gifts to noblemen by the Nizam. About 15 million acres, that is about 30%, were under the Jagirdari system. The Jagirdari system of land administration was the most important feature of political organization of Hyderabad. The Nizam created his own noblemen and bestowed on them one or the other distinguished rank and order, each with a large grant of land. In return, the trusted noblemen undertook to maintain the army for Nizam to rely on in time of need. The Jagirs were typically feudal tenures covering about some 40,000 square kilometers in area but scattered in different parts of the state. Nearly 6,500 villages, that is about a third of the state's total area, were under the Jagirdari system. The civil courts had no jurisdiction on Jagir lands, and therefore Jagirdars and their agents or middlemen were free to extort from the actual cultivators a variety of illegal taxes on them. The peasants in these areas were nothing but bond slaves or total serfs under the Nizam. Whatever little rights existed in the Diwani area were denied to them. In the Jagir areas constituting 30% of the state, Paigas, Shamsanans, Jagirdars, Irjadars, Banjardars, Makardars, Inamdars, Agrahamrams were various kinds of feudal oppressors. Some of them used to impose and collect taxes to their own revenue officers. Some of them paid a small portion to the state, while others were not required to pay anything at all. In these areas, various kinds of illegal extractions and forced labor were common. In the Jagir areas, land taxes on irrigation were 10 times more than those collected in the Diwani areas, amounting to Rs 150 per acre or 20 to 30 mounds of paddy per acre. Some of these Jagir paikas, especially the bigger ones, had their own separate police, revenue, civil and criminal systems. Feudal exploitation in Telangana. Nowhere in Hyderabad state was the feudal exploitation of the peasantry more intense than it was in the Telangana district. Some of the biggest landlords were the Jagirdars or Deshmukhs, owned several villages and thousands of acres of land each. Concentration of land ownership in the hands of few landed magnates was most pronounced in Nalgonda, Mahbubnagar and Warangal districts than elsewhere. Significantly, it was this region which was the locus of peasant insurrection in 1946 to 51. Jagirdars and Deshmukhs were also called Dora in local dialect of Telugu, meaning sir, master or lord of village, was often a combination of a landlord, moneylender or village official. Vetti system, forced labor and extractions. Traditionally, the Doras enjoyed several privileges, including the services of occupational caste, free of cost, and such exploitation was called vetti. The landlord could force a family from among his customary retainers to cultivate his land or do one job or the other, whether domestic, agricultural or official, as an obligation to the master. Each Harijan family had to send one man from the family to do vetti. In a small hamlet, Palle, each house had to send one man. The daily work of these people consisted of household work in the house of the Patel, Patwari, Malli Patel or Deshmukh, carrying reports to police station, taluk officers, tehsils, keeping watch on the village chavdi, village center and the poundage. They had to do extra work whenever an officer came to the village chavdi. Further, the Harijans who carried on the work of cobblers, standing leather, stitching stores, preparing leather accessories for agriculture operations, for drawing water from wells or for yoke bells for plough cattle or for drought bullocks, were forced to supply these to the landlords free of cost, while the rest of the peasantry used to pay them fixed annuities in grain and other agricultural produce. Certain other backward communities like Bolayu, Bestalu, Chakali were forced to carry down the shoulders men and women of the landlords' families, especially made carriers, palkis, menas covering long distances from one village to another whenever they wished to see their relatives or go to festival. When members of the landlord family travelled in the fast bullock carts, these people were forced to run before the carts as well as behind them as path clearers and escorts. When members of the landlord families rode horses, the horse servants were forced to run beside them. The worst of all of these feudal exactions was the prevalence of keeping girls as slaves in the house of the landlords. When landlords gave their daughters in marriage, they presented the slave girls and sent them along with the married daughters to serve them in the new homes. These girls were then used by the landlords as concubines. The various forms of forced labor and exactions were exacted not only through landlords but by the officials, petty or high, living in villages or coming to tours or special visits. The vetti system made the life of Telangana people one of abject serfdom and utter degradation. It ruined a man's self-respect completely. The movement for its abolition became widespread. The Bhagela serfdom. Bhagelas, meaning mostly to the aboriginal ties, were customary retainers tied to their master by debt. Doing domestic or menial labor and deeply in debt, they had to work for their masters generation after generation on a subsistence wage. Of the landless poor, the worst were no doubt the Bhagelas. Thou all had to perform forced labor called bhatti. The Bhagelas were typically untouchables, bonded to their masters through debt. Wages were low, interest rates were high, records could be manipulated easily. When the Bhagelas died, they were almost always still in debt. The debt was inherited by the next generation and the landlord never had to worry about finding free labor for menial jobs. Economic hierarchy and caste hierarchy. Brahmins were one predominant among the substantial landowners and patadas in the Telangana district. With the rise of the Reddys and Balmas, the two notable castes of peasant proprietors, the influence of the Brahmins and landowning caste declined. The Komtis, a caste of traders and moneylenders, has considerable influence on the economic life of the countryside. From the turn of the century, Marwadi Sahukas gradually penetrated rural Telangana and established their ascendancy as money lenders, although the Komtis still remained on the scene as traders, shopkeepers and merchants. The bulk of the rural masses, poor peasants, uprooted tenants, sharecroppers and agricultural labourers, came either from the lower caste or from the tribal groups like the Hill Reddys, Chenchus, Koyas, Lambadas and Banjaras. The tribal communities had long-standing grievances against the government on account of its taxes and levies against moneylenders and the revenue officials who usurped the land, and also against private contractors who exploited the tribal laborers in the forest, on construction sites, or in mines and collieries. Agrarian economy. In a predominantly rural economy, land and labor were the principal means of production, but the countryside was not a self-contained rural utopia. It was connected both to the industrial and merchant economy of the towns, and more importantly to the world capitalist system. The development of irrigation facilities and cultivation of commercial crops had taken place since the late 19th century. The mere commercial crops of Telangana, groundnuts, tobacco and castor seeds were grown in Nalgonda, Mahabubnagar, Karimnagar and Warangal districts. The development of commercial farming was not matched by any corresponding growth of towns, of industrial enterprise and markets, or even of transport and communication facilities. Cultivators had to depend almost entirely on urban money lenders, traders, merchants and businessmen who controlled the few and the highly centralized markets in Telangana for sale of the produce. Local retailers, agents and village sahukar helped urban commercial interests in securing the produce from the cultivators, and thus managed to have a share in the profits of the marketing enterprise. Land alienation increased considerably between 1910 and 1940, particularly during the Depression, when many lands previously owned by tribal peasants passed into the hands of non-cultivating urban interests, mostly Brahmins, Marwadis, Komtis and Muslims. As a result of growing land alienation, many occupants or cultivators were being reduced to tenants at will, sharecroppers or landless laborers. After 1930s, the proportion of non-cultivating occupants and of cultivators of land, wholly or mainly unowned, began to decline. On the contrary, owner cultivators and agricultural laborers steadily increased in number in Hyderabad state as a whole. The rise of the rich peasant sector did not supplant the landlord tenant sector of the rural economy completely. Absentee landlords were very much there, though the number was declining after 1930. However, a large proportion of the rural population consisted of landless agricultural laborers and poor peasants who worked mainly as laborers but who owned a small piece of land. Then, according to 1951 census, the two groups made up almost 40% of the rural population. Agricultural laborers made up to 32% of the population dependent on agriculture for livelihood. Employment was uncertain and seasonal, high being harvest time, the total duration being at most 5 to 6 months per year. Wages paid in kind were pitiful. For example, in Huzurnagar Taluka in the district of Nalgonda, wages for a 9 to 14-hour working day amounted to 1.5 kg of paddy during the slack season and 2.25 kg during the busy season. Production relations internal to the countryside are one but side of the story. The other is incorporation of this rural economy into the world capitalist system. Here, cash crops like peanut, castor, linseed, sesame, sugarcane and tobacco were the vital links. Hyderabad, with more than 30% of the sown area under non-food crops, was significantly more involved in primary commodity cash economy than the rest of India. Politics and the Telangana Peasantry, 1936 to 46. Despotic rule of the Nizam permitted neither political freedom nor any representative institutions. Harassment of suspected political activists, detention of leaders, potential agitators were such common forms of repression that a straightforward political movement was almost ruled out in the state in 1930 or so. However, after 1920, several members of the intelligentsia and liberal professional classes in Hyderabad, inspired by Indian national movement, formed three different cultural literary forums, one for each three linguistic regions of the state: Telangana, Marathwada, Kannada. Andhra Mahasabhas was for the Telangana region. The Andhra Conference and the Andhra Mahasabha. It was set up in 1928 and began to mobilize public issues, public opinion and issues like administrative and constitutional reforms, schools, civil liberties, recruitment to services, etc., reflecting partly the regional economic and political aspiration and partly the urban, middle class and elitist character of the new political activity. During the Second World War, the Andhra Conference expanded its network in Telangana villages by taking an active interest in the agrarian problems such as wetty labor. Just across the Telangana border, that is in the Andhra Delta districts of Madras Presidency, a political movement for the unification of all Telugu-speaking regions into separate Vishal Andhra was launched by the Andhra Mahasabha. Following the Satyagraha, the Congress was banned in 1938 and so was the CPI. with the result that Andhra Congress and Mahasabha had the entire field of politics wide open for their activities. Communists who had been active in the Delta district since 1934 arrived on the Telangana scene only after the later half of the war. The young radical elements within the Andhra Conference turned to communism and converted the cultural form into mass militant organization, a united front of the youth, peasant, middle class and workers against the Nizam government. Through the Andhra Conference, young communists voiced the peasants' grievances, paid more and more attention to agrarian problems in Telangana, and mobilized opinion in favor of abolition of landlordism and oppressive Vetti system. The agrarian slogans and demands of the communists included abolition of Vetti, prevention of rack rending and eviction of tenants, reduction in taxes, revenues and rents, confirmation of occupancy, that is patta rights, cultivating tenants and so on, which naturally attracted the poor peasants, tenants and laborers to the Andhra Conference. Class position of the communist leaders. By and large, the communist leaders were wealthy landlords, pattadars of substantial holdings and men of some hereditary standing. They had shown some generosity towards a poorer section of the peasantry, whom in fact they hired either as a tenant or temporary leases or agricultural laborers. The class interest of the leading communists lay in promoting a class alliance between rich and small holders, tenants, cultivators, landless laborers against those isolated landlords, landholders who were either inconsiderate to the tenant cultivators or paid poor wages to these laborers. The class interest and alliance were evident in the demands of the abolition of Vetti, prevention of eviction, confirmation of occupancy rights of the tenants, increase in wages. The government's bid to resolve the food crisis in 1946 by means of compulsory levy affected mainly the rich and the middle peasants, while several landlords and deshmukhs evaded the compulsory levy, hoarded food grains and profited from rising prices. The beginning and the growth of Telangana insurrection. Between 1942 and 1946, the influence of communists over poor peasants, tenant cultivators and landless laborers grew steadily. In certain parts of Nalgonda and Warangal district, the Nizam's swift writ had virtually ceased to run at the beginning of 1946. Officials as well as landlords who did not pay protection money, who were afraid of visiting those areas of the jurisdiction or estates where the communists had established strongholds. The presence of a number of landlords owning large estates extending over thousands of acres of land had facilitated the expansion of communism in this area. In the post-war mid-1945 crisis, local branches of Andhra Conference called Sangams launched village-level struggles for better wages for laborers and against Vetti labor, illegal exactions, evictions and also newly imposed grain levy. The landlords had either fled to safety, resorted to litigation and summoned their own gundas and the police to deal with the rebellious peasants. The first major incident. In July 1946, when over 1,000 peasants armed with lathis, that is sticks, slings, took out a procession in a village that formed the part of Vinusur Deshmukh's estate, the landlords had gundas fired at the procession and killed Dondi Komaraya, the village Sangam leader, and injured a few others. The procession turned into an angry crowd, went to the landlord's house, which was about to be set on fire when the police arrived and dispersed it. Komaraya's martyrdom sparked off the conflagration, and the large and destructive fire had marked the beginning of Telangana's insurrection. By the end of July 1946, peasant resistance and militant action against the landlord, Deshmukh and village officials spread to almost 300 to 400 villages in Nalgonda, Warangal and Khammam. Nizam's government banned Andhra Conference in October 1946 and arrested several hundreds of CPI workers and sent more police reinforcement to the troubled areas. So determined was the resistance that landlords and Deshmukh found it difficult to get the villagers to perform Vetti. Smallholders did not hold a part of their paddy crop as required under the procurement levy regulation and foiled all coercive attempts of the village officials and landless laborers and evicted tenants held tight on the lands they had. Salient features of insurrection in its initial phases. Large masses of peasants spontaneously participated in the struggles directed against the government, landlords and the Deshmukhs and their agents. Insurgents had neither firearms nor training required to use them. A few volunteer crops had come into existence which were not so much organized guerrilla squads as ad hoc formation in response to the situation. The communists of the Andhra Conference, Sangams and Dalams such squads acted as moral boosters for the peasant action, but there is little evidence to suggest that they had succeeded in challenging spontaneous upsurge to systematically planned offensives. Thus, the emphasis in slogans being on a variety of agrarian matters already referred to was on the unity of various peasant classes, whether of rich or small patadas, cultivating tenants or landless laborers. As the present insurrection spread in rural Telangana, the Nizam's government sent batches of Razakars, a paramilitary voluntary force, sometimes with but often without the police or army, in order to deal with the rebels and to protect landlords and officials. Razakars raided and plundered the troubled villages, arrested or killed suspected and potential agitators, terrorized the innocent, also abducted women as part of the campaign of punitive measures against turbulent and agitating villages where the peasant masses were coming under communist influence. Communists set up village republics, Soviets, which functioned as a parallel government in the areas under the control. In about 4,000 villages, a parallel administration was established by the communists. The Andhra Delta, a flat plain of alluvial deposit between diverging branches of the mouth of the river, had become the supplies base of the peasant struggle in Telangana. Gram Rajyams, village soviets set up by the rebels, functioned very efficiently. The lands seized forcibly were distributed among the land-hungry agricultural laborer and also among the evicted tenants. The guerrilla scouts protected the village under the control, while the village samitis settled disputes and coordinated activities at the local level. Decline and the insurrection. In September 1948, the Indian Army marched into the Hyderabad state territory, and within less than a week, Nizam's army, police and Razakars surrendered with hardly any resistance. The Nizam ordered his troops to cease fire, outlawed and banned the Razakars, and lifted the ban on the state congress. The government of India called its military invasion of Telangana police action, and the Indian government's concern over the undemocratic feudal regime of Nizam, who patronized Razakars terrorism, was really secondary to the fears of Telangana peasant insurrection and a possibility of communist capture of power in the heart of the Indian territory. Once the Razakars were overpowered, a military administration set up under the command of General J.N. Chaudhary. The offensive was immediately directed at the peasant rebel. According to Sundaraya's report, 3 lakhs people were tortured, about 50,000 were arrested and kept in detention camp for a few days to a few months, and more than 5,000 were imprisoned for years, and over 2,000 peasants and party workers were killed. In less than a year, the Indian Army took over the administration of Hyderabad, and it issued a Jagir abolition regulation and appointed an Agrarian Economy committee to recommend a comprehensive land reform legislation in order to neutralize the communist influence among the rural masses. The three-pronged attack by the communists. The communists wanted first to put an end to Vetti and demand wage increases. Secondly, they condemned the large-scale eviction of tenants and demanded both abolishment of landism and a moratorium on all debts. Thirdly, the communists adopted a dual policy on the question of procurement of grain through compulsory levy. On one hand, they deplored the landlords and Deshmukh's evasion of the levy regulation and the hoarding and profiteering. On the other hand, rich peasants and well-to-do landholders and smallholders who supported the party were encouraged to withhold the grain levy. Conflicting interest among the participant classes. The demand for increased wages were bound to affect the well-to-do peasants, whose primary interest lay in keeping the wage level down and in avoiding the grain levy. Those rich peasants who were with the party and had sympathetically met the demands of the sharecroppers or laborers were treated as neutralized, and the lands and paddy stocks were unscathed and untouched. As insurrection developed, poor peasants, particularly tenants and sharecroppers and landless laborers, began to seize lands from the landlords and Deshmukhs to occupy wastelands, which later they distributed among themselves. In deciding which surplus land to seize, Sangam leaders made liberal concessions to the rich peasants who sided with the rebels. The sealing question and the way it was settled finally in favor of the rich peasant reflected a reformist understanding of the agrarian problem of Telangana on the part of the communist leaders. Desertion of the alliance by the rich peasants. After the military action in September 1948, the rich peasants increasingly deserted the alliance in which the agricultural laborers, tenants, poor peasants, together with some smallholders, middle peasants, were left to carry on the insurrection. Most of the recruits to the Dalams came from untouchable caste, Mallas and Madhikas, and from the tribals. The role of the rich peasant was anything but revolutionary. As the grip of military administration tightened, troops began to suppress Dalam ruthlessly. Some rich peasants will continue to display loyalty to the party, providing food and shelter to squad leaders, and guerrillas also acted as informers to the army and police. Research sources suggest that middle peasants do not constitute a significant social category in Telangana, either numerically or politically. The poor and the landless laborers provided the backbone of the resistance from the beginning to the end. Causes for withdrawal. The general political instability and the rapidly developing crisis of authority and legitimacy were the most immediate circumstances that facilitated revolutionary mobilization of peasant masses in Telangana, but organization which played a vital part in sustaining revolutionary elan and intensity, such as land seizure and establishment of Gram Rajyams, and in making the mass politically effective, did not exist. The village committees which ran the parallel governments were isolated from each other and lacked proper coordination. Although they distributed land to the landless and to the evicted tenants for cultivation, they had no access to market, could not speak of control of it. For trade and essential supplies, the rebels had to depend on the urban merchants and traders, whose agents at the village level had to be bribed by the samitis to market the product of the rebel villages. Disunity in the class alliances crept in. Inter-party differences over ideological issues and over broad objectives of the revolutionary struggle was another factor. The Indian Army's presence had enabled the landlords in Deshmukh to recapture some of their very lands. Very few tenants actually registered themselves and claimed occupancy rights. Majority of them were either evicted from lands before the actual enforcement of the new statutes or had surrounded the lands voluntarily. The success or failure of the revolutionary movement depends largely on the importance we attach to certain goals. If seizure of power for a considerable period is seen as a goal, no other peasant revolution in India was more successful than Telangana. If lasting change in agrarian structure and living condition is seen as a goal, it was no more successful than other peasant movements in India. Students, if we summarize this Telangana movement, we would understand that Telangana movement has been considered to be one of the successful movement with regard to peasant mobilization. What did we learn? We also learned that Telangana movement also faced desertion of the rich peasants from the movement. Initially, they were an important part of the movement, but later on they left the movement in midway. Further, we have also looked into how agrarian crisis was in the background of peasant armed struggle and movements for separate statehood that we could see in Telangana. Further, the Telangana movement raised issues in terms of inequality and underdevelopment that has faced a big problem with regard to agrarian structure in India.